It was 50 years before she spoke to him again. Not when he was elected president or governor, not even when reporters pleaded with her for information. Until the day of her death, Jane Wyman remained silent about Ronald Reagan. We now understand why. The reality surrounding their divorce is more sinister than anybody could have ever guessed. From the terrible murder of their infant, to Reagan's covert FBI job as Agent T-10. She determined never to mention his name again, since the ideal Hollywood pair was concealing something so agonizing. Heartbreak was the beginning of Sarah Jane Mayfield's life. Her parents' divorce in 1921, when she was just 4 years old, upended what appeared to be a typical middle-class life in St. Joseph, Missouri. Her father then passed away just 3 months after. Little Sarah Jane was left behind when her mother relocated to Cleveland. She lost her entire world in addition to her parents. Emma and Richard Fulkus, her foster parents, weren't very affectionate or kind. Their house was rigid, aloof, and frigid, and Richard worked as a police investigator. Later on, Sarah Jane would acknowledge that the severe discipline had left her resentful for years. She lived with 2 foster children, and occasionally referred to herself as the youngest of 3, despite the fact that she had no biological siblings. She even adopted the family's last name informally, using it on official documents and in school. She temporarily lived with her foster mother in California when she was 13, but she quickly moved back to Missouri. Something changed at home. She was no longer just Sarah Jane. She started singing on the radio and went under the name Jane Durrell. In order to work, she altered her birth year to appear older, even though she was still underage. People listened to her voice. Despite all that had happened to her, she possessed something that set her apart. She left high school before she was 15 years old. Her dreams were not limited to Hollywood. She took it. The first significant step in creating a new life, not simply a career, was that jump. She was determined, strong, and prepared to face the world. And she did, slowly. Her efforts eventually paid off in 1936. She was signed to Warner Brothers when a producer called Brian Foy recognized her potential. Using the last name of her first husband, Ernest Wyman, she was formally Jane Wyman at the age of 19. Although she claimed to be 19 on paper, she had married him when she was 16. The name and the contract endured even though the marriage did not. She was finally in the door at Warner Brothers, but it wasn't a glamorous one. The studio was unsure on how to handle her. She was given little pieces that hardly allowed her to shine. Despite the frustration, she persisted. For young women in particular, the studio system proved difficult. You had to follow instructions. No matter how minor the job, stay working and smile for the cameras. Tiny parts and hard days characterized Jane's early Hollywood years. In 1932, she made her on-screen debut as a chorus girl in The Kid from Spain. However, no one was aware that she was in it. She starred in movies for years without having her name included in the credits. As she waited for someone to notice, she continued to dance, smile, and recite her lines. She was consistently employed by Warner Brothers, but often in B-movies. They kept her in front of the camera, but they were simple, low-budget comedies and musicals. These movies didn't make you famous. However, they provided her with experience. She gained skills in acting in front of a camera, surviving in the business, and being prepared for her big break. Jane Wyman was confined to playing unmemorable parts in mediocre movies prior to 1945. She simply wasn't taken seriously in Hollywood. However, when she was cast in Billy Wilder's The Lost Weekend, everything changed. She wasn't even the first option, which is amusing. The third was her. Jean Arthur and Katharine Hepburn had declined. However, Wyman seized the opportunity to play Helen St. James, at a period when most people wouldn't even discuss alcoholism. The movie addressed it. Initially, audiences had low expectations, but after minor adjustments, it took off. In addition to Best Picture, it took home 3 additional Oscars. Everyone was taken aback by Wyman's nuanced and poignant performance. She was no longer only a gorgeous face. Her death was ultimately seen by critics. She went from being a forgettable B-movie actress to someone Hollywood had to take seriously after that one part. She demonstrated that it wasn't a coincidence just a year later. Wyman in The Yearling was a different person. She portrayed Ma Baxter, a tough, shabby frontier mother who lived in the Florida woods. People weren't used to the glitzy Jane Wyman they knew. She dismantled everything, even learning about the lives and occupations of actual women in the 1870s. Initially, Warner Brothers execs were unsure. They believed that viewers wouldn't like her in that state, but following her performance in The Lost Weekend, Jack Warner had faith in her. As it happens, he was correct. Wyman was nominated for an Oscar for her performance, which demonstrated to the world that she was capable of playing emotionally charged parts. It didn't matter that she didn't win that year. Hollywood attempted to keep her in the box, but she had definitely burst out. When Johnny Belinda arrived in 1948, Wyman's skill level skyrocketed. She portrayed Belinda McDonald, a deaf-dumb woman who endures parenthood and sexual harassment in a little fishing community. It was a tragic tale that Hollywood had never presented in such a manner. Wyman spent months getting ready. In order to live in complete quiet while filming, she even used wax to block her ears while attending a school for the deaf. The fact that Wyman herself had advocated for the film years before, after seeing the stage production in 1940, only served to heighten its impact. After nearly 10 years of waiting, she eventually succeeded. Both spectators and critics were astounded by her performance. With pages of speech, she communicated more than most actors could, yet not saying a word during the entire movie. She became the first person to win an Oscar for a silent part during the sound era when she took home the Best Actress prize that year. With 12 nominations, the movie received more than any other that year. Officially, Wyman was at the top, and in typical Jane Wyman fashion, she accepted that Oscar when it came. A smart 16-word statement that left the audience howling was all that was needed. No lengthy speech or dramatic monologue. "I'm quite appreciative of this for once keeping my mouth shut. I believe I'll do it once more." After that she left. When Ronald Reagan and Jane Wyman first met, they appeared to be the ideal pair. Their affair began in 1938, while they were both young, up-and-coming Hollywood stars working on Brother Rat. Jane, a gorgeous blonde with a keen sense of humor and a commanding personality, captured Reagan's heart. He wooed her with a ring set with more than 50 carats of amethyst, her birthstone. Their story had made the top page by the time they were married in January 1940, in a little church in Glendale, California. Hollywood was infatuated. There were pictures of their wedding everywhere. Warner Brothers capitalized on this by portraying them as the industry's best duo. Behind the scenes, however, the narrative wasn't quite as flawless. Not only did their acting careers receive a lot of attention, but their personal lives certainly did. Both of them participated in the Screen Actors Guild. That's when things started to change. Reagan's rise was rapid, particularly following World War II. At a time when the Union was experiencing significant turmoil, he assumed a key leadership position and was elected president of the SAG in 1947. Jane was also on the board, right there. They had a purpose because of their common job, but it also began to drive them in divergent directions. While Jane remained dedicated to her performance, Reagan started to concentrate more on politics and union issues. The sadness that would alter everything then arrived. They lost Christine, their baby daughter, in June 1947. She was stillborn. According to some others think she was only alive for a few hours. Neither of them knew how to communicate it, and neither could adequately describe the anguish. 3 months prior, Reagan had assumed the presidency of SAG, and now their family was in ruins. Soon later, Jane and him parted ways. She filed for divorce a year later. The truth went deeper than the emotional abuse she recounted. There was a hush between them that nothing could break because of the loss. Then there were other issues. Not only did Jane Wyman play Belinda in Johnny Belinda, but she transformed into a whole other person. She shut out the world to portray a rape victim who was deaf-mute. She used wax to block her ears. Even at home she ceased talking. For months she played up to her role, signing rather than speaking, even to her husband Ronald Reagan. They had just lost their baby girl, which is something no parent should ever have to go through. However, rather than sharing in the grief, Reagan buried himself, while Wyman buried herself more in her role. In the politics of unions, there was more than just method acting in the quiet at home. It came to pass. Their marriage had already ended by the time the film was released, and Wyman took home an Oscar. Most people were told that Reagan's increasing participation in the Screen Actors Guild caused them to drift apart, and that politics was the reason it terminated. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a nice reason, and the studio liked good stories. Reagan hauled her to meetings and disregarded her ideas, according to Wyman. That much was true. However, nobody discussed the cruelty allegation she made in court, the rumors that she had become close to Lou Ayres, her co-star from Johnny Belinda, or the fact that Reagan's acting career was stagnating while hers was flourishing. Reagan even made a sour joke about blaming Johnny Belinda for the split, and the agony of losing their kid was very raw when all of this occurred. "I don't know a damn thing about politics," Wyman said, dismissing the political element years later. She was aware that it was just simpler for everyone to blame politics. However, Reagan was leading a parallel life behind the scenes. He was secretly giving the FBI names while publicly advocating for justice and togetherness. He and Wyman also identified actors they believed to be Communist Party sympathizers under the code number T10. Although the findings were suppressed for several years, Reagan was already at odds with the Bureau in 1947 when he denied knowing about communists in his official statement. Meanwhile, Wyman was becoming sick of it all. She concentrated on her work while Reagan was preoccupied with Red Scares and secret reports. It was another secret they never discussed aloud, another rift between them. Their fall was further exacerbated by the stress of living under FBI and public surveillance. Jane Wyman was granted complete custody of their children upon the divorce's completion in 1949. However, being a present parent and having custody on paper were two whole different things. She had limited time to nurture her adoptive son Michael and daughter Maureen since her career was taking off. Reagan only saw them on Sundays and frequently took them to church since he was too busy with his own life. They were often reared by domestic workers and nannies. According to Michael, it wasn't until he was 25 that he truly got to know his parents. And that was all uttered in 1 second. Reagan asked his son, "My name is Ronald Reagan," after delivering a commencement address at Michael's school, "Which is yours?" Michael would be plagued by that statement for the rest of his life. Despite having two well-known parents, both kids felt unimportant. Jane Wyman established one rule as soon as the divorce became known: don't bring up Ronald. Not to the media. To fans, no. She remained silent even decades later, when Reagan was elected president and everyone wanted to hear from his first wife. She silenced reporters who mentioned Reagan. "I've made 350 television shows and 86 films," she once remarked. "I have 54 years of experience in this industry." She did not want to be remembered as Reagan's ex-wife or as a political footnote. That was all she wanted to be known for. In the 1950s, Jane Wyman and filmmaker Douglas Sirk collaborated, and the result was a cinematic masterpiece. She was contributing to the redefining of what a Hollywood melodrama might be, in addition to performing. After reading the novel, she promoted the movie Magnificent Obsession as the first step. This movie provided the spark both Sirk and her careers needed at the moment. In addition to being a box office success, it signaled the start of an original creative collaboration. Wyman was given the opportunity to shine with the type of subdued passion that has a greater impact than loud remarks, because to Sirk's use of color, reflections, and ideal framing, All That Heaven Allows, their subsequent movie, took it a step farther. Wyman portrayed an isolated widow who develops feelings for her gardener. It was strong, but not because of the narrative. It was the way Wyman conveyed both optimism and sadness, with a single deep inhale or eye twitch. What appeared to be a romantic tale was actually a subdued protest against the strict regulations of 1950s society. And over time, critics have only grown to value that more. Things weren't always that easy behind the camera. Wyman had to deal with a young Rock Hudson who was having trouble keeping up during Magnificent Obsession. It took him hundreds of takes to perfect a scenario. It also obviously tried her patience, even though Wyman remained professional. Nevertheless, she never made fun of him or expressed her annoyance. "You were nice to me when you didn't have to be," Hudson said years later, expressing his gratitude for her generosity at that period. In an honest moment, she disclosed how much she had carried without complaining. Like few others, Wyman continued to win accolades throughout it all. In 1948, she played a deaf-mute lady in one of the most impactful performances of the decade, earning her first Golden Globe for the role in Johnny Belinda. The Blue Veil followed in 1951. Another victory served as a reminder to Hollywood that she was here to stay. She won a third Golden Globe that year, this one for International Film Favorite, evidence that she was more than simply an American celebrity. Perhaps her greatest victory, however, was when she won Best Actress in a Drama Series for Falcon Crest in 1984 at the age of 67. She took on a new TV job and demonstrated that she still had it at a time when other actresses her age were having trouble finding employment. The Golden Globes continued to appear, honoring performances that the Academy frequently missed, while the Oscars only awarded her one trophy. Following her divorce from Ronald Reagan, Jane Wyman's life took a dramatic change. Jane discovered something very different, spirituality, while Reagan began to go toward politics. She appeared in the 1951 film The Blue Veil, which told the story of a lady who loses her child. I was personally affected by that position. Jane had lost her own infant daughter, Christina, only a few years prior. She started to experience a change in herself while filming in New York, close to St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is surrounded by Catholic religious symbols. She instantly felt the agony she had been carrying for years. She had previously been spending solitary time with the Dominican nuns and going to Mass with her friend, the actress Loretta Young. However, the Church's teachings that suffering might have purpose now seemed intimate. Jane would never be the same once she became a Catholic on December 8, 1953, 2 years later. Although she had a strong faith, her personal life continued to be complex. She had married Hollywood music director Fred Karger shortly before her conversion. The marriage was short-lived. They parted ways after just 2 years. However, it was not the end of the story. They remarried 6 years later and made another attempt at marriage. It didn't. In 1965, their divorce was finalized. By that time, Jane had already been married 5 times, including her well-known union with Ronald Reagan. However, she never got married again after that last divorce. She stayed unmarried for the final 40 years of her life because her Catholic views on marriage and divorce had become a compass. Reagan was advancing into power, while Jane was introspecting. He still identified as a Democrat in the early 1950s, but gradually, his opinions began to change. He thought the party had shifted too far to the left, particularly in regard to the economics. He began sending letters in the early 1960s, expressing his inability to continue supporting the Democrats. Interestingly though, he didn't immediately switch parties. He just managed to maintain his Democrat registration long enough to run as a Nixon supporter in 1960. He was able to connect with middle-class voters because to that title, he didn't register as a Republican until after the election. In the meanwhile, an odd incident occurred on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1960. Jane Wyman received 2 stars instead of only one for her television work and another for her film career. It was a unique accolade that demonstrated her accomplishments in a field that tends to overlook its stars as they get older. Reagan stunned almost everyone, including Wyman, when he declared his intention to run for governor of California in 1966. When she first met him, he was a struggling actor who was now discussing ways to clean up Berkeley and combat welfare fraud. Reagan portrayed a typical American who was tired of the way things were being handled. He gained popularity because to his charisma and sense of humor. It seemed like a man not taking himself too seriously when he quipped, "I don't know, I've never played a governor, but people took it seriously." He defeated Pat Brown, the incumbent, by about 1 million votes. It must have felt weird to Wyman. The guy she had divorced over 2 decades prior was now the head of the nation's most powerful state. Then another odd moment occurred. How to Commit Marriage, Jane Wyman's last film, was released in 1969. While her daughter was getting married, she portrayed a mother going through a divorce. Despite being a light comedy, The title may have seemed a little ironic. Reagan was one of Wyman's 4 previous marriages. As a result, she became the only woman in American history to be the former spouse of a future president. Reagan was battling student riots and budgetary issues during his first term as governor, as she was filming sequences on broken marriages and changing family values. It was the ideal illustration of how their lives had diverged, his toward national prominence and hers into introspection. Wyman was more than just an actor, though. She was among the first female television show producers in the 1950s. It made her a boss, and Jane Wyman Presents the Fireside Theater wasn't simply another show. She collaborated with authors like Rod Serling and Gene Roddenberry, who would go on to transform television, appeared in episodes and assisted in selecting scripts. Wyman went on to start her own production business. She was adept at managing her profession and adjust to the times, just as Reagan was learning how to modify his political message. Both were former employees of MCA and its studios. They were both creating something fresh. However, Wyman was demonstrating that women could physically run the show as Reagan was speaking about the future of America. Those two routes could not have been more dissimilar. By 1969, Wyman was finishing up her last movie. Reagan was battling UC Berkeley student demonstrators. Things were violent that spring. Following an altercation over People's Park, Reagan dispatched hundreds of National Guard soldiers to the university. The air was filled with tear gas. One individual lost his life, and several were injured. Reagan refused to compromise. It was messy, but necessary, he remarked. He made it plain that he would not put up with what he dubbed orgies of destruction and accused students of picking and choosing which laws to obey. His popularity to conservative voters nationwide increased along with his reputation for law and order. Wyman, meanwhile, avoided the limelight. Regarding her ex-husband's behavior, she remained silent. She maintained her honor as she always had. She lived in a world of silent farewells, cameras, and scripts. Reagan's world was heading for something considerably more significant. In the 1980s, Jane Wyman accomplished something amazing in secret. She controlled primetime television and made 10 times as much money as her ex-husband Ronald Reagan did while he was in charge of the U.S. Wyman earned $3 million a year while she was at the top of her game on Falcon Crest. Reagan's pay as president, however, was only $200,000. It was an odd turn of events. Both had achieved success decades after their 1948 divorce, but they were in quite different worlds. Wyman was enthralling millions of people each week as Angela Channing, a ruthless, crafty matriarch who ruled a fictitious wine empire with an iron grip, while Reagan was influencing world affairs. Everything changed because of that character. Wyman, who had portrayed gentle, empathetic ladies in movies, was suddenly the face of one of the most formidable and feared women on television. Angela Channing was adored and hated by audiences. She was more than just tough. She was brutal. Wyman wasn't certain she wanted the part at first. However, something clicked when she read the pilot script. She was aware of this character's uniqueness. Thus, Wyman accepted the role of Falcon Crest's backstabbing queen, while Reagan exuded charm and hope in Washington. In 1984, as Reagan was running for a second term in office, she received a Golden Globe for the role. However, the character wasn't the only reason she decided to join the show. It was also a cunning strategy to avoid unwanted attention. Reporters' obsession with Wyman returned in 1981 after Reagan was elected president. Everyone was curious about their history. She didn't. She had no intention of speaking now, and she had been silent for decades. She has the ideal shield thanks to Falcon Crest. She was too busy working, shooting, and creating a persona that kept people riveted to their televisions while everyone else was chatting about the president's ex-wife. She dismissed the insatiable interest and stated, "I'm just going to live my life and have fun." However, Wyman was battling her own conflicts behind the scenes. She had significant abdominal surgery in 1986 as a result of a serious intestinal obstruction. Despite being 72, she was adamant on going back. The actors greeted her with a banner that said, "Welcome home, Jane," and a red carpet when she arrived. However, it wasn't the end. She passed out on set in 1989. It was discovered that she had liver problems, extremely high blood sugar, and chronic diabetes. Doctors advised her to quit her job. Her character was written into a coma, therefore she missed the most of the last season. Wyman didn't want to say goodbye that way though, so she returned. She went back for the last 3 episodes in defiance of medical advice, to assist with writing as well as acting. In an effort to provide supporters with genuine closure, she wrote her own parting address. "A toast to you, Falcon Crest," Angela remarked, lifting a glass to the vineyard in the last moment, "and I hope you live a long time." It was Wyman's method of bidding her go. After then she only appeared on screen once more, in Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman, 1993. Then she left the acting in silence. Wyman remained silent during the Iran-Contra controversy, even as investigations and media hysteria rocked Reagan's government. She saw the headlines blow up, the hearings drag on, and even Reagan's closest supporters turn away. She had the opportunity to speak up, write books, do interviews, and profit from the commotion. However, she didn't. She said nothing. Furthermore, her words were overshadowed by the quiet. Wyman only partially broke her silence after Ronald Reagan's death in 2004. She just stated that she had lost a wonderful president and a nice, compassionate man after all those years. 13 words. That was it. No autobiographies, interviews, or personal tales, just a single brief statement, followed by another pause. And in that quiet, Jane Wyman established a legacy based on decency as much as skill.